Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this month's Artist Talk. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Juliana Biondo, and I'm the Assistant Curator at the Art Program. And today is one of our monthly Artist Talk series as part of the We Are Africa exhibition. We've been working on this exhibition for about a year now, and we basically are highlighting creative voices from the continent and showcasing them alongside of World Bank development specialists to showcase the crossovers between creative practice and international development practice. And so this month, we're featuring two fantastic speakers who are going to share more about creating more innovative practices in education, curriculum development in Lesotho. And as we continue on with this work, I also want to highlight the kind of partners that are behind it. So we have the art program, and we've partnered with the Blog for Dev community. And our fabulous moderator today, Dimpho, is a winner of the 2020 Blog for Dev competition. And the art program with the Blog for Dev have joined forces to create Art for Dev, which is the official group that hosts these talks. And so as we continue on, we'll have one artist talk a month, and then it will culminate in a virtual exhibition of the creative voices we've been collecting over the year, and it will be a virtual exhibition and a digital catalog. So stay tuned for that. And then just a bit of logistics, we encourage you to drop your questions in the chat throughout the conversation because we will have a Q&A at the end. And please feel free to kind of interact and kind of share your thoughts. So we will first hear from Lineo. And Lena is a longtime creative writer who's part of the movement spearheading creative industries and art events in Lesotho, first as an events manager and media officer at the Morgia Museum and Archives, and currently as the head of content division at the Selema Learning Network. She's a founding member of Gender Entrepreneurship Empowerment in Media, GEM, and is an active promoter and participant in the arts and crafts scene in the Mesuru region. She holds a Bachelor's of Honors in International Business from the Limpopo University of Creative Technology and was named a Hubert H. Humphrey Fellow in 2016 for her status as an international leader working to address local and global challenges to foster change for the collective good. So over to you, Lineo.
Where we held annual festivals, and at these festivals, we featured discussions, panel discussions, bookmaking, activities for children. We had poetry recitals, we had performances of all kinds, including theater, and we also had book sales and book presentations of sorts. So over the years, we then grew a little bit bigger. We started doing smaller projects. We had a calendar of events where we had writing competitions and spelling bees and all manners of writing workshops. First, it was just focused on the art and technique of writing, but then it evolved over time and became more, I want to say more focused, because we also delved into research where we focused primarily on the history of the Sesotho language and the impact and influence of colonialism on it, given that the written form of Sesotho was sort of directed by Swiss and French missionaries in the 19th century, and how this now impacts our relationship with the language and how we continue to, I guess, how we continue the legacy of storytelling, because storytelling is how we retained our history over time and what connects us, given, you know, traditions such as storytelling and storytelling as in folk tales under the fire, how, you know, we didn't have books, we didn't write books, but we knew our lineage, for example, through song and through poetry and stuff like that. So at some point, this had to evolve. So we started being more interested in curriculum development as well, where we were focused on the impact of storytelling on curriculum, you know, because things that kept coming up were like statements such as kids don't have a healthy relationship with Sesotho because they say they can't read it. And if they can't read it, you know, it impacts the way their performance at school and also their attitude towards the language, but it also influences how they relate to other subjects at school as well. So we tried to come up with a literary or literature-based approach on to encourage students to sort of find a new way of absorbing new information and new knowledge in whatever subject that they might be doing, because we had the understanding that we're all storytellers by virtue of being Basotho. We're always talking to one another. We're always communicating things we've heard or things, some sort of announcement or other. And so we came up with what we called a learning unit under the context of another roadmap. Another roadmap is an international, I want to call it an alliance, but it's a collective of practitioners within arts education who are interested in how arts education practice is done within their various locales. So we have representation on 4 continents, and we have what we call the Africa cluster, which, though not primarily, we tend to analyze the impact and influence of colonialism on how art is perceived, art is created, and how art is, I guess, modeled within the education context and others, but specifically art education. So within the context of another roadmap, Africa Cluster, we then did a series of research initiatives, and our findings include what we learned about Lesotho and the attitude that children have towards it. But we also had a project we called the Parenere Dictionary, which was sort of our response, given all the research that we had done, to how then do we grow our language, given that at the very core of it, there were no particular rules as such on what constitutes the right Sesotho. So what if we just freestyle? What if we just used our creative agency to come up with words for things that are now part of our lives, but we don't have the vocabulary for? And this kept evolving over years. We did workshops around it. We did a collective thinking exercise. We experimented in various ways. And we even took it as far as an art exhibition in Paris that had, I think it's still on until December, where, yeah, we were shown based on this crazy concept of inventing language, but also why not? So this is where we are right now. We then evolved again this learning unit into a curriculum, so to speak, that is supported now by a rubric, because we wanted to have the same activities be done within the formal education system. And in the formal context, you have to know what you're measuring and what the conditions for what you're measuring are, and all the factors involved. So we developed a rubric for, and then we called it Pedagogy learning unit. It was for a project-based learning activity that was focused on the arts and entrepreneurship curriculum of Lesotho. We based ourselves on the objectives listed within the syllabus, which out of the 31, we chose about 8, and we decided that this is what we would focus on. We prototyped this with a group of tutors and some students, and even had feedback from them in terms of the how it felt doing the exercise, but also the impact that they were seeing within their students. Yeah, I think I've said a lot now. Can I just pause there for a second?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Dineo. And I really think opening us up to some of the incredible work that you've done around literature and creativity, and this very interesting idea of inventing language, as you put it, and why that's important to enable learners especially to participate well or meaningfully as they go about their learning journey. I did make an error at the beginning. I didn't read out your bio. So in the interest of protocol, I'm going to do that now. So for those of you who may just be coming into the room or may just be joining us, we've just heard from Lineo Segoete, who is a content creator from Lesotho. She is a longtime creative writer who is part of the movement spearheading creative industries and art events in Lesotho, first as the events manager, media officer of the Morja Museum and Archives, currently as an independent consultant. She has been a sub-editor at one of the leading newspapers in Lesotho. She's an active promoter and participant in the arts and crafts scene in the Maseru region. She's also a communications coordinator for the Gender Entrepreneurship Empowerment and Media Institute, or GEM. She is a B Business Honors graduate in international business from the Limpopo University of Creative Technology. I really hope that I pronounced that correctly. But as we can see, Dineo is quite a busy person, accomplished. And I think that in her presentation, we also just saw how these worlds of business and education and creativity all come together in her work. Right now, though, we're going to hear from our next speaker, who is an education consultant based in Maseru. She is Tshegofatso Thulare, who is an education consultant of the World Bank. She completed her master's in globalization and educational change at Lee University in the USA, a Fulbright Foreign Scholar Award recipient for 2016. She has also worked on one of South Africa's early grade reading studies for the National Department of Basic Education at a leading education management nonprofit here in Johannesburg. She's also worked collaboratively with teachers and school learners in communities of effective practice. She's passionate about the nexus of development and large-scale systemic education reform on the African continent. So, Tshegofatso, we're really looking forward to hearing what you're going to say and how you're going to build on from that presentation that Dineo has given us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dimpho, and thank you to Dineo and to the other co-hosts. Happy to be here, and as I've been introduced, I'm Thulare, and though I am currently based in Maseru, Lesotho, I am a South African by training and also by birth too. And as I've been growing and learning in the Lesotho portfolio, I thought this would be a really good opportunity to also just sort of show the broader and bigger picture of the portfolio that we have out here and how it is that it's actually been speaking towards really the life and individual development that we hold quite closely to ourselves. So a large part of the portfolio has actually been based around basic education and junior secondary, primarily looking at tackling efficient service delivery and working with ministries as being bank-funded projects. We work to capacitate and strengthen systems within the country, and part of those systems are the system actor being the Ministry of Education and Training, and we work quite closely with them and other development actors in the country too. From basic education being primary schools to secondary schools, there's a large array of issues that we've needed to focus on, but primarily it's efficient service delivery, which means teaching, learning, instructing, creating safe spaces, school construction, and addressing some of those supply and demand issues that exist within the country and within the sector too, but also looking at also improving student retention. And when you look at it at a macro level, one of the biggest issues that Lesotho actually faces alongside other sub-Saharan African countries is, though over the years, in the past decades, there's been such a push to get children into schools, we're struggling to keep children in. And so school dropout, and primarily in the senior secondary phase, has also been quite rife. Over the years, we've also realized that in order to be able to actually effectively capacitate and grow full individuals, a new approach that we've taken is the life cycle approach. That's also meant that there's a recognition that education and understanding and learning really does happen before a learner walks into the classroom. And primarily in sub-Saharan Africa and also all over the world, a lot of that care has come from actually early childhood care and development. And so our portfolio has also been growing around ECCD. And when I was invited to talk about to this talk around innovating education in Lesotho, and primarily where creativity and curiosity could actually be harnessed and where that could be coming through. One of the key projects that we've been working with in collaboration with UNICEF and supporting the ministry was revising and revamping the ECCD curriculum guide. And within that reviving and revamping the curriculum guide, it's allowed a conversation of not only curriculum developers, but also stakeholders, and also to a large part, a consultation with women who have often led quite very separate and far away from institutionalized government like framework, where they have actually had the biggest share and the biggest burden, and unfortunately on their own for the longest time, around taking care of children and also getting them ready in order to be able to enter formal schooling or quote unquote traditional schooling. And this conversation actually really did open up avenues to really sit down and visualize what it is that we wanted to be creating around the Lesotho child, and what it is that both in classroom and out of classroom, the communities together need to be doing in order to have the child be able to progressively grow into a thriving, active, and an individual who's able to do things for themselves too. And at the heart of the ECCD curriculum, the conversation really did center around some of the values that we want to be inculcating. And part of those values is the extent that teachers themselves are able to model them, but also create safe spaces for the children, that the children can also see them in their own peers. And one of the figures that I have decided to sort of forefront today, also in the Lesotho ECCD curriculum guide of 2021, was around the cultural values, and that conversation that's really come up there. And so looking at making sure that respect, care, humanity, peace, responsibility, and accountability are also infused in it, and not only what we teach, but how it is that we go on to teach. But next slide. More importantly, it's the approach to learning that really starts to get quite exciting. So for the longest time, there's, not even just the longest time, there's a genuine and active realization that creativity and the ability to build and be free and be curious and questioning is actually a fundamental skill set that children need to be learning, and also need to be modeling and need to be growing and experiencing while they're in every day of their lives. And so central to the curriculum was the learning through play, direct instruction, guided play, free play, and games. But how it is that you do this is just constantly always making sure that we're creating environments where the children's creativity, curiosity, playfulness can be enriched, while also learning some of the key concepts around perseverance, self-confidence, trust, and responsibility. And some learning concepts to make sure that children continuously have that backbone and that reinforcement around cultural connections. So whatever it is that we're learning, a child is recognizing how it is that they've come to be through other people, and that the country and their community plays such a central role to who it is that they want to become. Literacy in language, as we heard from Dini, coming through really quite strongly too. Oral storytelling being the heart of how children begin to learn, but long before they even start reading, and that and also early numeracy, and personal identity, advocacy, and self-expression. So those are one of the areas that we've been working with and supporting the ministry through, and a really great way of where creativity is not only being inculcated and instructed, but also fused through the approach of how it is that we're teaching learners. But taking also quite seriously that it's not just about the numbers and reading, but it's the joy of learning, and that really does push societies forward too. One of the other components before we move on to the next slide is around youth groups and youth clubs. And some of these youth clubs have ranged from theatre to choir. Some of them have been around science, reading clubs. And one of the ways that we've really been thinking about how to primarily get learners engaged and to stay in school, especially in the senior secondary areas, has been how to find spaces for youngsters to not only be themselves, but to also be able to question and ignite their own passions in ways that we wouldn't necessarily be able to do while slogging through the syllabus and through the everyday curriculum too. And so one of the approaches that we're trying to do under the pipeline project that's coming up, the Basic Education Strengthening Project, is really like strengthening and providing resources towards the various NGOs within the country, as well as some of the youth leaders in communities, to get them to be more involved in schools, and primarily through helping to create these safe learning environments. That would also then mean that learners have an opportunity to not only be mentored and tutored directly by people that they can be visualizing themselves in through role models too, but have some serious conversation around personal behavior, around taking accountability for themselves, around entrepreneurship, as well as also just keeping them passionate and engaged, doing activities that they want to be doing too. And so the youth groups and the youth clubs is also another component that we're quite excited about, that I think falls quite nicely into today's topic. And then last, if we do move on to, is keeping central to the role of the community around supporting and strengthening schools. And I hope this comes out in discussion a little bit more, but one of the other projects that we've been doing here has really been around how do we increase involvement and commitment of community members around the ownership of schools, and to care about what it is that happens to schools, but also give voice and agency in order to be able to actually keep leaders accountable about what happens to schools. And one of the primary disjunctions that we've always seen is that when there are schools that are needed and required, you'd often get this top-down heavy firm that comes in, they come in with their laborers, they build, and sometimes that also can get quite chaotic. In Lesotho, we've been dealing with quite a few fraudulent, unbuilt, unrepaired schools that have been happening, and communities being really frustrated. It's like, well, what can we do? These people didn't even care enough to finish the jobs that they're doing. And what we're trying to do is actually bring in, through community construction committees, parents, traditional leaders, chiefs, local councillors, people that literally get adopted into a school, and they're the ones that go on to actually call the shots and guide where it is that we hire labor, and that actually being the youngsters that have like aged out of the schooling system, as well as people that they know around actually needing the work. They get to guide and be actively involved while also earning an income from building the schools that their children will be attending, that their children already attend, that someday that they might also want to work into. And so that's that one component of like, how do we then ensure not only sustainability, service delivery, but some of those other things that we're talking about around accountability, involvement, and commitment. And it's not always a perfect model. There have been some challenges, but this one has really definitely started taking up and giving not only just voice, but it's given people a sense of pride in not only the schooling services, but also that schools being often, especially in the areas that we deal in, quite remote, quite far, and incredibly rural, almost forgotten to a certain extent. One of the few ways they interact with government instructional services, government services, is actually through the schools. And so that sense of pride and ownership, that I actually care about what goes on in here, also coming in from the fact that I helped to build it, physically building. And so the people who we're seeing here in the pictures are people who are like, who don't live too far away from it too, and are earning an income from the school. And then the next photos, those images, just really sort of highlighting as best as possible the collaboration that's been bringing in, the closer conversations between school management and administration, as well as local community actors and people who haven't felt that they could be a community actor, even though like they have children that go to that school, but a sense of that remoteness and rurality, and really foregrounding it that one of the main approaches, even under the country partnership framework that that Lesotho will be taking forward, one of the key cross-cutting drivers and levers that we're looking at is how do we actually take a geographic and spatial reality of Lesotho, and making sure that we target efficiently and effectively where services are strengthened and bolstered. And this was primarily one of the ways that we did that, through a mapping exercise, a spatial mapping exercises, and saying we have high poverty rates in this one side, we're seeing a huge amount of school dropout that's happening out here, and that also comes with its own social illnesses, but we're also seeing this big gap in service delivery, and how do we bring that all together too? So those are the three bigger projects that I thought would be good to highlight.
Thank you so much for that, Tshegofatso. There are a few really good points from your presentation that I just want to speak to. I think one of them was the issue of self-expression and kind of how bringing in that creativity and arts within the curriculum allows learners to not only interact better with each other, but to be able to express themselves, and in that being able to then find their passions better. And then again, this initiative at the end where you are kind of co-creating by building with communities instead of building for them, and seeing how that sense of ownership creates then sustainability. And you also have people more involved and invested in the education system, which also then I imagine has a domino effect, because if people are more invested in the education, then we will see better results. So thank you so much for that. We are going to go into our Q&A part of today's conversation, or our panel discussion, I beg your pardon, panel discussion part of the conversation before we get into our Q&A. So before we get started, just again, I'd like to extend the invitation to everyone who is in the room with us to please make your inputs heard. If you have any questions or comments, you can make use of the chat function, or you can chat to us on social media as well. I know that the hashtag we're using is Art4Dev. I know that you've both touched on this briefly in your presentations, but I just kind of wanted to highlight it as a separate element. This issue of how creativity strengthens curriculum development, and not just the development of curriculum, but also how learners are then able to process and consume that content. I think we can start with you, Dineo, then I'll give you an opportunity to speak to that, Tshegofatso.
Is it okay if I continue that video?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So in my experience over the years, I'll give an example of several young people we've worked with who have gone on to do what to me seems like incredible things. So one student came to our festival, didn't know what to do with her life, writes me a couple of years later and says, hey, because of what you've done for me, I was able to enroll into and finish a journalism course, and it's the best thing for my life. We've had other young people go on to have young festivals of their own, also somewhat related to cultural strengthening and expression and things like that. Others have gone on to mentor others under them. So for me, this is a demonstration or evidence of the impact of creativity on young people. It also says to me that if we were to invest a little bit more in it, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of resources, then there's only, like, the possibilities are endless, because the students I'm talking about are people who are based in the urban space, but children who are in the rural areas don't have this kind of access. And it becomes a frustration to me and others like myself, because we know that there are people with great intentions within the education system who would like to, expand access to these children, but be it matters of finance or whatnot, it is not possible to do this. And then you find in some instances we don't have enough teachers, or we don't have enough teachers who can teach certain things properly. So what we're trying to do is combine education technologies that are available, that are more or less inexpensive, and then target those very students who are in those very far away places. And we're still very young in our efforts, but we'll see within the next couple of years how this works out, because so far we have worked with 2 batches of students at universities in Leribe, and not universities, at high schools in Leribe, excuse me. And these students are able to tell us how they are doing through creative expression. So they write poetry or they make stuff. Some are very crafty. And this is how, for example, they said they coped through the whole COVID disaster that we all went through last year. Some of them were able to earn money through the creative talents that they had. and some were able just to stay sane throughout that entire process. So for me, these, although seem small, are evidence of how great the impact could be if we were to scale.
Jump in?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that, I really like that. Maybe before you chip in, Toho, I think this element of self-expression keeps coming up. And one of the first talks that we did was around GBV. And one of the main things that came up in that conversation is just how important it is for people to be able to express themselves in their languages, because oftentimes, especially in children, that's the only way they're able to alert someone that they're being violated. So this idea of people being able to express themselves in their languages, people being able to express, their bodies and their anatomy in their language is very important. Like what you're saying with some of the learners you work with, at times it's, language medium that they have or creative expression is the only way that they can let you know that they're not okay and that they may need some kind of help. So I really, really like that point. Yes, Toho.
Excuse me, before Toho continues, as you mentioned that, actually, the first year that we did a writing competition, I think it was 2015, there were 2 entries there of young girls who were about 16, 17, who were in separate parts of the country, but both of them wrote about a similar GBV situation where they were being raped by their fathers. And they said, even in their submission, that they wouldn't have been able to tell anyone this had it not been for this thing. And, there's only so much you can do given cultural context and so on. But those children, because now they could speak about it, where at least we attempted to give them some kind of, mental health support. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that.
And I think the part that I really want to also jump in on and emphasize around too is the potential catalytic effect of youth groups, and primarily youth groups led by other youngsters that are not too far away in age to the learners themselves, able to play that mentoring role, as well as that visionary role, that confidence that they can get that this is who I could be. There's another way of being in life, but that safe space approach in order to be able to actually talk a lot more closer with someone of your own age too. I mean, we know that there are and there ought to be larger services and social workers available to schools for them to be able to actually undertake not only just investigations and assessments of learners that could potentially be vulnerable or have survived these kinds of abuses too, but that there's a disconnect too, because the primary role is often involved with the power dynamics of a youngster having to come up to another adult and tell them about another adult and what it is that they're doing about them, about that. And one of the main rationales and thinkings around that is just creating that safe space for learners to be able to freely express, talk, but get those strategies, life skills, and broaden their horizons and eyes too around what it is that they could do. Going back to your earlier question on the role of creativity in strengthening curriculum development too, I think another way of that is actually what it is that Dini has been showcasing over and above, is this really tight story of people who are working in conjunction with education sector, wanting to be folded into it too, right? So it's fresh new young voices that are coming in, where we know that for years we will always need not only curriculum developers, but actually story writers and writers in the languages that children read and learn and want to escape in so that they can enjoy themselves, but also in stories that children see themselves into. And there's always an opportunity for that, and primarily in the primary early grades, and some projects that I've worked in the past, where like literally we have gone out and sourced young writers to write new stories for young children, while also learning the linguistic the linguistic requirements of how it is that you write young learners who are also in the process of learning how to read, in order for them to be able to then read to learn, to start knowing how to learn, and some of the just the science behind reading for it too. So it's not only in what it is that the curriculum inculcates, but I think the story that we're coming through from Dineo too is how in developing of the curriculum, we're leaning and looking for creative ways, of the final products and the syllabuses. But obviously, and this will always remain a key priority, I think, is just making sure that when we are in our syllabuses, in our work plans, that teachers have available in their toolkits games that speak to not only cultural references, ones that they played with themselves too, but stories and books and literally learning material that is grounded in their reality and grounded in the kind of aspirational reality that we want children to be growing up in too. Thanks.
So what I'm hearing is that it may not always be possible, or it may not even always be necessary to create a whole new system. But what these art programs allow people to do, or young children to do, is to interact with the existing system better and in a way that I think is more sensitive to what they need in order to grow and I think to self-actualize. So I really like that. There's a comment here from Fan Yang who says, love learning and play integration. What do you think about incorporating Indigenous knowledge in the curriculum to preserve cultural heritage and also to add to the global knowledge pool? Also, any thoughts on using Indigenous language in teaching? Thank you. I'll start with Toho, and then we can go to Dineo.
Thank you. That's clearly a drive that's actually behind a lot of the like the teaching and learning materials, and primarily around the storybooks. So we know of the African Storybooks initiative. It's a little bit of a bigger one. It's more popular in South Africa, and I think it's still growing with its footprint too. And in part of that is not only accessing the current knowledge that is co-created in the societies that we want to live in too, but harnessing back into actually like older ways of being, older ways of knowledge too. And also leveraging on what it is that teachers themselves know, what it is that parents know. And so in what you'll see in a lot of the curriculum too is an understanding and recognition that children don't come in as slates when they walk into their centers. They don't come in as completely devoid of anything that they would know. So part of those ways is also actually like harnessing what it is in the different ways that children actually know and building off of what it is that they know and understand. And a lot of that also really speaking to some of the cultural ties that they already have. And I think it's a brilliant idea in order to be involving and actively keeping alive Indigenous language, Indigenous knowledge primarily through Indigenous language. And one of the key opportunities and ways that I've seen that happen actually is through storytelling. And through storytelling and through fictional books where a learner is then learning to read, but you also get to then hear the same story in an Indigenous language. But that would also obviously take resources and incapacitation, not only for the teachers, but making sure that those voices are at the table when these stories and curricula are designed. Thanks.
I completely support the idea of using Indigenous languages to teach young people, because there's a reason it's called mother tongue. It's the first language you're speaking in, and it becomes easier to absorb new information if it has been transmitted in a language that you understand. Now, the problem with a place like Lesotho is that there are minority languages that are not represented within the schooling system, whereby students in some areas are doing particularly bad because they don't understand the concepts that are being taught because they're not being spoken to in their own language. I think that alone is evidence of the value of teaching in one's. And as far as Indigenous knowledge systems go, it goes beyond just the classroom environment. It goes as well to identity and how and these students' self-knowledge and the cultural exchange thereof, especially because the world is globalizing, whether we like it or not. And we also deserve to have a footprint out there in the world, especially being a small country where we tend to be clustered, instead of being recognized as a sovereign country with its own identity and its own history and things like that.
Yeah. Thank you for that contribution, Dineo. I am going to move on to my next question for the both of you. And I think it's around how do we address the issue of social ills around the education system. I know that Toho mentioned some of these, the issue of learners sometimes dropping out of school, particularly the boys. You know, in your experience, how can these art programs then help to address some of these issues, but also just create a place of support for learners while they're still in school? Anyone can go first.
Okay. So we had a stakeholder check-in a few years ago where we were consulting with what are called herders, yes, herders, in the rural town here. And what we discovered was that they have very interesting creative projects going on, but the issue was also now how to sell these products, how to market these products, and how to not get cheated out of the products that they were making, because some of them were actually quite innovative. And for me, this gave me the realization that we need multiple kinds of literacies in those spaces. And it's a matter of getting the, I don't know, the institutional buy-in from the government, because there's only so much an NGO can do, you know. They spoke about how non-formal education had tried to have programs running there with them, but either due to a lack of resources or a lack of personnel, the program was discontinued. But for them, they still had something to do. They still had something to fill their time through those creative projects that they had going. And I think that's an example of how this, I don't know, it's an example or representation of what else is out there as far as creative production is concerned. It's not just a matter of whether it's there or not, it's also a matter of sustaining it and making sure that people can live off of it.
That people continue to find purpose and value in it too. No, completely agree with that. Really do agree with that. Your question is a bit of a loaded one because
True.
but primarily because we sit at a stage where we're able to see on quite a larger scale some of these social ills that require not just one single strategy. And I don't necessarily think it will be one part of the sector rather than a collaborative multi-sector approach to it too. One of the biggest drivers around student dropout has actually been a plain old reason of poverty. And the fact that we have long, deep ingrained roots of young boys actually opting out of schooling in order to be able to actually start either fending for themselves or fending for families, or even fending for their futures. If there is an opportunity to one day be a farmer yourself, this is where you start. You start by herd boying. So there are all these tugs and pushes and pulls that we're not also understanding very well in terms of what it is that's pushing and pulling the drivers of boys. Because for the past few years, a lot of research has actually focused, and rightfully so, on the girl child too, and some of the social vulnerabilities that the girl child has been going through. So we do also recognize there's a bit of a gap when it comes to the boys themselves. But this one primary driver that comes over and out through various surveys and data collection that happens of why youngsters leave school, the biggest one will actually be like, I can't afford to stay in school, will be number one reason. And then the second is, I can't carry on being in school for other reasons. For girls, we hear a lot of child pregnancy and early child marriage to one extent. And another thing that's come up from boys is just a lack of interest. There's competing priorities at home, competing identities that you also want to be a part of, and not earning a salary or not earning even some kind of money when you get to a certain age, also actually really tugging at their sense of value. And then when you dig a little bit deeper and you start seeing that, we also start seeing some of these trends coming in through on just poor performance, and poor performance actually also really creating this vicious cycle of like, if I'm not finding value in school and I'm doing badly at it, why should I be here? If this isn't a place that I feel that I can not only see myself, see a future for myself and the value of this too, but keep me engaged and entertained and give me opportunities and options to access other ways of being. then that becomes a primary driver that we also drive them out. And that's where I would see the arts program needing to be strengthened, and that being a way that we can keep learners engaged and plugged into schooling, but also the recognition that that won't be the only way, because we're sitting with this other bigger monolith that's actually really influencing everything else, is how do we actually sustainably and empathetically deal head on with the fact that we're also living in a country where it's tough making ends meet. It really is. And that burden is also then falling onto children themselves. And one of the other projects in the pipeline that we're actually looking at is around this demand side nexus. So it's a mixture of supply and demand, but really around making it more attractive, or at least taking off the burden of the school fees for young learners who are in this area. So earlier I talked about the spatial geographic layout, and so having literally picked a few councils where we see this high dropout, we're wanting to see, well, what could that possibly do for 2 to 4 years of supporting learners who, if you didn't have to worry about school fees, and you had these other enticing programs and youth clubs and opportunities for mentoring and tutoring, while at the same time we're also working on making sure that there's effective instruction. Because when you actually can see and understand that, oh, I'm actually getting a really good service here, and I'm getting good grasps of just like the basics of what it is that I need in order to not only pursue further education, or how it is that I go on to be entrepreneurial myself, that also then makes school a place of value and a place of purpose. So it's kind of coming at it in many different directions. And yeah, we're still learning about what it is that's going to be effective or not. And one of the powers that World Bank really has around that is sort of like the convening power, but also the analytical power of actually recognizing and seeing that these are issues that a lot of countries in the world are actually dealing with. And so we have that knowledge base to also tap into and learn from other contexts that are very similar to. And so that's also what's informing the development of some of the programs.
Yeah. So it's about using the artistic work and the creative programs to keep learners engaged, but understanding that ultimately we also need to address the more systemic, deeply entrenched issues around poverty, around access, and maybe also cultural barriers, right? Which is a very important point. And I like that you highlight as well that some of these issues are actually very similar, not just on the continent, but throughout the world. Speaking about keeping learners engaged, what is the value, right, when we have these programs? What is the value of, like you mentioned, during your, Tshegofatso, during your presentation, of not just capacitating the learners, but also capacitating parents, capacitating teachers, and maybe even getting the entire community involved in order to support these programs that are meant to keep learners engaged while they're still in school?
The value of it? The value of it is really, well, at least the way I see it, and it might be a little bit naive, but we keep kids longer in school, which literally changes their life outcomes. It changes their life expectancy. It changes the opportunities that they have, that they're able to unleash and unlock for themselves. It means that they're not only reliant on government services and like provisions from social safety nets, but they can actually go on to also access different markets and a whole different global village for themselves. And it really does give them that basis and the ability to stand on their own and work for themselves. And for every single individual that we can keep within the education system, that's that number more of people who are able to access more opportunities for themselves. And over and above accessing opportunities, I think this is something that we really want, or at least hungry for every time. I mean, being a youngster myself in Southern Africa, where and this really is my own opinion, but something that I really do feel is that we're fed up of the opportunities and options that we see. We want to start creating our own opportunities and options for ourselves. And schooling and finishing schooling is over and over, and this is what the Human Development Index from the World Bank actually keeps showing over and over again. This is the one biggest powerful tool that we can literally change children's lives and start chipping away at this monolith around poverty.
Dini, your thoughts?
And just to build on that, through practice, we have learned that if you speak to students in a language that they understand, and this means relating to them through their interests, through their home life, through how they speak, how they see things, how they, process information, through the activities that they engage in and outside of school, through the media that they respond to, then you're more likely to make progress than using the same old model that was tried on our parents and on our grandparents. So I don't know. I think for us, we're just looking for a place that we belong as people who are trying to innovate within the formal structure. We just want our methods to at least be, acknowledged, embraced, so that once they see the results that they actually do have, something can change. And once we put students at the forefront of these efforts of, to transform the education system and to build on the vast value of education, and the evidence is right around us, like it's everywhere. Countries that have great schooling systems are doing very well economically, and human development index and so on and so forth. And it's not that we don't have an education system here, it's just that it needs reinforcement, it needs a little bit more care, better care, but also it needs to be a little bit more open, because there are many methods towards achieving the ultimate results that we can, as far as the potential that our children have, the possibilities that we could reach, and especially because we're a developing country, and it's like fertile land. The way that I see this country, it's you enter in space and there's so much development that you can do on it, versus looking at it and saying, oh, there's nothing here. So
Yeah, creating space, I think, excuse me, is what I'm hearing. Making space for young people and practitioners like yourselves to be able to innovate within the education system, so that we're able to meet the needs of, I think, the 21st century learner and what their aspirations are. Like Tshegofatso said, we're tired of the opportunities that are handed to us, and we really want to have more of an input and creative control, right, of the kind of opportunities that we create. We have run out of time, and we were meant to have a dedicated Q&A, but I don't see any other questions in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and ask my final question, which is kind of like also just allowing both our speakers to give us their parting shots. And it's around what we can do to support creativity and to support creative work within the education system. I think Janelle mentioned that a lot of the people who participate in these programs were then able to create some kind of income during the pandemic, or are able to be enterprising. How do we strengthen that, and how do we support that? 2 minutes. I'll start with you, Toho.
Oh, I thought it was Dino first. No, absolutely. I would definitely say give of your time to especially organizations like this, able to actually volunteer. And if you can't give of your time, give of your money. By local artists, making sure that you are engaged and actually go and enjoy like local literary festivals too. I'm still waiting for that day where we have sponsors out there that are actually sponsoring youth fests and theatre fests and literary fests for high schoolers, or even just like primary schoolers, or putting money towards writing competitions, or putting money towards so anything that really does support what it is that learners themselves can actually like want to do and spend their time making creative productions themselves. But knowing that that's actually supported by a larger community of people who are engaged and close by. I've always been a firm supporter of adopt the local school near you if you can, primarily through those two ways. If you can't give up your time, give your money. Thanks.
So in short, open up your purse.
And on that, open up your purses and buy supplies, buy artworks, and invest in capacity building, invest in all forms of training, both for teachers and also for artists, because then you can leverage on the expertise that artists have to teach children and, you know, carry it on through things like apprenticeships and so on and so forth. And recognition. There's still a very disheartening tendency for people not to recognize certain initiatives because they're being introduced by young people. Therefore, what do you know? What do you have to offer? And then this just prolongs the process and all the work that could be done because of personal politics. And just generally, yeah, show love, you know, like show up, be a volunteer, buy something and show up.
Yeah. So in short, open up your purse, give up your time, and also give up your time for capacity building, and also recognize young artists. I think that just also fuels them to continue doing the work that they're doing, because the creative industry or the creative sector can be very, very challenging. I people who grew up in African homes. But thank you so much to our speakers for joining us. Thank you to our audience members. This has been a very enlightening conversation. I've had so much fun just engaging two brilliant women and really hearing your thoughts and perspectives on how we can use and channel art and education for development in Lesotho, but I think across the continent as well. Thank you to Juliana, to the arts team at the World Bank, to the Awesome Blog for Dev team, to the Art for Dev team. We're still having more of these conversations where we'll be spotlighting African artists, but also really exploring that intersection between art and development and art and social impact. But from myself, Dimpho Lekgeu at the foot of the African continent in Johannesburg, thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone. We echo all that Dimpho said. So thank you and stay tuned.
Goodbye.
Bye.